right. Let's get started with a little Stanford football talk. I'll get us started, and then I'll let Matt chime in. Let's start with the 2022 edition in regards to we're coming off a stretch where David Shaw, one of the more respected head coaches in the nation, really had it rolling there for a long time. 11-19 the past 3 seasons. What is the outlook for 2022? What are the concerns? What are the hopes?
Well, the hopes is that it doesn't look anything like 2021 for starters. You can go through the litany of injuries and you can talk about all the COVID hardships, and it's all true. But the fact remains, I think everybody internally understands that, they need to be better. They took it to heart after last season. They went through what they say is a soul-searching process where everything was on the table in terms of tweaking both sides of the ball. It kept the coaching staff intact, decided to kind of, dance with who brung you, so to speak. David Shaw is as loyal as it gets in college football in terms of, believing in his assistants. And so we will see what the new look brings us. It's hard to forecast. The one tangible change on the defensive side of the ball is they've switched to a 4-3, which they tinkered with at the end of last year, which I think plays more to the strengths of the defensive roster. But if you want the Cliff Note version, the offense on paper should be really good, and the defense needs to figure out a way to make a vast improvement because it's been not good enough the last few years.
Scott, my main initial question to you is that, if you look at college football history over the past 40 years, one of the more significant rivalries was Florida State-Miami. And the particular point I want to make about that game as a lead into the Stanford USC game this year is that, when Florida State played Miami, it was usually an early October game. So in the first half of the season, and Miami was structured such that, it emphasized basic fundamentals, didn't try to be too adventurous in its offense, whereas Bobby Bowden really was more improvisational and more imaginative on offense. And usually Miami was a step ahead of Florida State, and Florida State would usually round into form in November because of all the things that Bobby Bowden was trying to do. So as we apply that to USC and Stanford, you have Lincoln Riley, with this freewheeling, high-octane offense. You have David Shaw, who likes to punch you in the mouth. And you could say that because of Stanford's more simpler focus, that getting this game early before USC's worked out the kinks could work to Stanford's advantage. But on the other hand, you have this other tension point where Stanford has this great recruiting class, did really well on the trail this past cycle. USC trying to rely on transfer portal acquisitions in this first year for Lincoln Riley. So my question is, with all that as kind of the buildup, does getting this game in week 2 early, do you think it benefits Stanford or USC more?
I would say it benefits Stanford more. I think that there's a couple of tentacles, and you touched on both of them. First you talk about, USC, and as decorated as Lincoln Riley is as a coach, and as terrific as that USC roster is certainly going to be, there's always growing pains, or you expect there might be growing pains. So I think just on the surface, you would rather get a team like that early as opposed to later. And you talk about, Stanford with the recruiting class. I think that's going to pay huge dividends for the Cardinal in 2023, 2024, and 2025. I don't think it's going to be a big deal for this year. We just don't see that many impact true freshmen. Now, that said, there are going to be one or two, particularly David Bailey, who's an outstanding edge rusher that I think is going to play right away, and he can be special right away. So, Stanford will benefit to some extent this year from the recruiting class, but really you're talking about more down the road, whereas transfer portal, obviously a different deal. These are seasoned guys. A lot of them are veterans. They've played big-time college football, so they're more apt to hit the ground running. So to answer your question, I do buy into the theory that if you give me the choice, I would rather play USC in September than in November. No question.
Scott Reese joining us, a Stanford play-by-play announcer. Scott, I can guarantee that most of our audience has not watched Stanford for the last few years. They are used to seeing the Stanford heyday of Christian McCaffrey and probably have not seen a whole lot in 4 to 5 years. We've got a USC strong audience, but we've got really a diversified fan base of college football viewers. So I'm going to get back to a term that Matt brought up, identity. We had a conversation last week, and in my eyes, the last great Pac-12 rivalry that captivated the nation was the matchup of Oregon and Stanford. And just the style clash was just remarkable for a college football fan to watch. And then seeing those offensive line splits about that wide for Stanford and them just pound and win some classic matchups with Oregon. Does this program still have an identity that it had 5-10 years ago?
I think that they are clinging to part of that identity. I think that at his foundation, the type of football that you saw Stanford playing under David Shaw during the early part of his tenure is still at his core the type of football he wants to play. He wants to out physical. He wants to, beat you on both sides of the line of scrimmage. It's fundamental to everything that he wants to do. But that said, he has shown a propensity more so in the last few years, I think, to adapt away from that to some extent and really out of necessity. Stanford has not had the dominance in the trenches in the last 3 or 4 seasons. They just haven't, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. And I think that's what gets lost when you look at Stanford and you think about all those great teams in the early 2010s and all the Rose Bowls, and you think about, Toby Gerhardt and Christian McCaffrey and Stephon Taylor and, and the great receivers and, first Andrew Luck and Kevin Hogan and on and on. What people forget is really, in my mind, the reason Stanford was so dominant for such a stretch was because the defense was otherworldly. I mean, they were a top 5 defense all those years where they were a top 5, top 10 team. And that's what has really fallen off. The offense has been inconsistent, but you look at this team on the offensive side of the ball in terms of recruiting and star rankings and however you want to break it down, returning talent, they should be really good. The questions are really more on the other side. So, I think to get back to the identity question is you are not going to see a pound the rock to set up Andrew Luck or Kevin Hogan and throw the ball. You're going to see the other way around. And I think it's out of necessity. It's not even, I don't even think it's going to be 50-50. I think it could be 60-40, honestly, this year, because that is where the talent on this team lies. And I think the coaching staff recognizes that you have Tanner McKee, who is a potential first-round draft talent at quarterback. You have a great and deep wide receiving core, and you have one of the top tight ends in the nation in Ben Urosic. And, oh, by the way, your top 6 offensive linemen are all back. So, I mean, there it is, right? Meanwhile, as you guys know, you had your top 2 running backs. One of them is now a USC Trojan, and the other one's at Missouri. So, I don't think there's any question when you look at this team offensively and say, what's the identity going to be? I think it's going to have to be more throw to set up the run than the way it's been for so many years.
So when we look at this matchup against USC in week 2, I think you've already kind of indicated that Stanford is probably going to lean toward throwing on first down to set up second and third down the way it wants to. In terms of the specific matchup against USC's defense, though, the defensive line, the USC defensive line, is probably the Trojans' weakest position group. So that sets up a very interesting dynamic where Stanford might think it necessary to run the ball, not necessarily because it leans on the running game. You've just said that you want to put the ball in Tanner McKee's hands, and I would agree. But yet you might want to run the ball just because USC's matchup isn't favorable for the Trojans if you try to run the ball. So how do you think Shaw and his staff are going to handle that particular point? Not just emphasizing their own strength, but maybe it's the better play to attack USC at its weakest point, which is running the ball.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair assessment, and I'm quite sure that will not be lost on the coaching staff, as they head into game plan for that game. For me, this is not a concession that, we're just not going to be able to run the golf ball, so we're going to throw it 45 times. I don't know what the running game will look like, and I'm not sure the coaches know what the running game will look like, because all of a sudden, instead of, an Austin Jones, who is a guy who can carry it 25 times a game, and he can be that between the tackles guy and do other things as well, now you're leaning on a couple of guys in E.J. Smith and Casey Filkins, whose strengths are more, receiving out of the backfield, lining up in the slot, running an outside sweeps. This is just they're two different backs than I think Stanford has had throughout this last, 10, 15 years. And so I think that's going to necessitate a different offensive philosophy and different style in running the football. Now, that said, would it surprise me to see them come out on a first drive against a USC team where you feel like maybe the front four is vulnerable and, hand the ball off 6 times on the first drive? No, of course not. I mean, obviously, every game will be tailored to the opponent to some extent. But I just say, I do think, big picture, we don't know what can E.J. Smith handle as a feature back. He's had a hard time staying on the field, got a ton of talent, does a lot of things well. He's Emmett's kid. Obviously, he's got the pedigree, but nobody knows at this point, what his limitations are in terms of being a number one back. Same for Casey Filkins. So we won't know in September. I think we'll have a better idea in October and November. And so, to your point, maybe from a USC standpoint, maybe you want to get Stanford early because, the running game is untested, unproven. And, maybe they feel like, okay, they don't have to worry about that right off the bat. I don't know, but it's an interesting matchup for sure.
Rivalries are everything in college football, but we keep hearing about the same handful of them. I think there's a few in the Pac-12 that get a little lost. Not a lot of people know about the venom between Washington and Oregon. It's real. It's deep. This is a different sort of rivalry. I've heard all sorts of opinions from people that cover USC and Stanford down through the years. Scott, how would you term the vibe, the environment, the history of this rivalry? How would you describe it?
For me, it's awesome. I mean, when you a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned, the Stanford-Oregon rivalry from the 2010s that was maybe, the national headliner. I would argue that within the conference, if you go back to 2010, right, you go back 10 or 12 years, has there been a better year in and year out rivalry than Stanford-USC? And I'm not sure that there has. When you look at the results, when you look at the drama, when you look at last second field goals in both directions, you look at, triple overtime at the Coliseum with Andrew Luck after he basically, for all intents and purposes, lost the game by throwing a late fourth quarter pick and then miraculously picked him up and they wind up winning. They're just the endings have been miraculous. The drama between two teams that over that stretch have been a lot more good than they have been not good, obviously, if you go back 12 years. This is, and it's the Northern California, Southern California thing, right? It's part of the reason that the 4 California coaches demanded we're going to play each other every year, right? Part of it's recruiting, and obviously we realize that, but part of it is because it's not just Stanford, Cal, and UCLA, USC. It's all 4 playing all 4. These games matter a lot to the fan bases, to the alumni, so. Look, if you ask folks within the program, which game would you most like to win over the course of a year? Yeah, maybe they'd say Cal number 1, and I almost guarantee you USC would be number 2. And that's largely as a result of what we've seen over the last decade.
A natural point to bring up here, Scott, is, now that the Pac-12 has changed the format of its conference championship game, and we're going to have divisions eliminated very likely for next year, what points of emphasis do you have personally? Not, we're not playing like if you were Pac-12 commish for a day, but just like you as a fan of Stanford, a fan of college football, a fan of the Pac-12, what do you think should be the scheduling rotation priorities for the Pac-12, assuming that they scrap divisions next year?
Yeah, I haven't thought that through in terms of exactly how I would script it. I can assure you that the California clause is not going to change, right?
Yeah.
So we're all going to play each other every year. So really, the effect on scheduling might be minimal. For us, whether or not, whether we're playing Arizona and Colorado versus, in any given year, Oregon State, Washington State, I don't think makes a huge difference in terms of, the outlooks. I think the move makes sense. I'm sure you guys have talked about it. Obviously, it's better for college football playoff implications, and it's better for the national landscape. It's not better for the Pac-12 North this year, I can guarantee you, because I guess I shouldn't say I can guarantee you, but my hunch is that somebody who would have been playing in the conference championship game no longer will be, is my guess. But again, we go into every season thinking we know, and there are always at least one or two teams we had no idea. We did not see coming one way or the other, right? Either at the top or the bottom. And that's what makes it fun. So, I have faith that they'll get the scheduling right. And at the end of the day, again, because those 4 California schools are locked in, and I think they still will be, I don't think it's going to affect Stanford in any major way going forward.
Scott, there's hope that Lincoln Riley is pumping life not just into USC, but into Pac-12 football. To another extent, Dan Lanning, of course, bringing a lot of excitement to the Great Northwest and replacing Mario Cristobal. What are your thoughts concerning Pac-12 football, where it stands right now? There could be an argument that 2021 was the worst season in conference history, considering how it performed against the rest of the Power Five.
I would support that argument. Clearly, the Pac-12 needs a jolt. Lincoln Riley is a real good start in that endeavor. Is he going to rescue the entire conference? That might be a bit much. But I think as much as, as much as fans outside of Southern California, I think like to see the big boys chop down the size. And by the big boys, I refer to, basically USC and to some extent Oregon. It's better for the conference, and you cannot argue how much better it is for the conference when USC is good, right? It's like UCLA in basketball, Arizona in basketball. The conference needs USC to be a legitimate contender year in and year out. I think that's a great start, and I'm sure Lincoln Riley is, going to be the guy that gets you guys back to where you need to be. The problems go beyond that, and we could spend a half hour talking about media deals and that sort of thing. I mean, that all has to be addressed. We know it's being addressed. We all have our fingers crossed and our toes crossed that when that gets done, we'll look at this and say, okay, now we're on the right track, because that may be the most important piece of any of it. But we're also still figuring out how this new age of college football is going to affect each of the member schools, right? I mean, obviously USC can get fat off the transfer portal, and Oregon has gotten fat off the transfer portal for years, and now it's even easier. Stanford suffers greatly relative to everybody else, right? Because we can't get anybody into school. We have one grad transfer this year who's, I think, the second one in a decade, and he didn't go through football. He applied as a grad student, got accepted as a regular student, and then called David Shaw and said, hey, I'm coming. You want me to play some ball, right? And happens to be an all Big 12 safety from Oklahoma. So you'll take that, but that's not happening year in and year out. So I think, there are going to be schools, Washington State, that there are going to be schools that have more attrition than they can bring in guys in fortification. So how is that going to affect the conference top to bottom in terms of are we going to see more of a chasm between the haves and the have-nots? I think it's all going to shake out over the next couple of years. And we can only hope, I guess, that the result in aggregate is, we're better now than we have been the last few years, because obviously it's been a tough couple of years, and get back to the college football playoff. That's first and foremost.
Scott, my last question to you would be, as we look at the long-term outlook for Stanford, so I'm not thinking of 2022, I'm more thinking about like a 2 or 3 year window. And of course, the Pac-12 championship game change has really increased the level of urgency for various Pac-12 programs, because now they know they need to be second in a field of 12 as opposed to being able to win what might be a weak division in a given cycle. So it forces every team to be better regardless of where they are. So if Stanford's going to be in the top 2 in 2023, 2024, what do you think needs to happen in general? I mean, obviously you talked about the recruiting class needing to hit the mark. But beyond that, like, Kyle Whittingham might retire after this 2022 season. This is his loaded team. This is his chance to chase the playoff. So he's probably going to call it a day after this season, maybe 2023 at the latest. And then you also have a new coach at Washington, the program which did muscle into Oregon's and Stanford's territory under Chris Peterson, but now is in a rebuilding mode, and we don't know what Kalen DeBoer is going to do. So in terms of Stanford getting up to number 2, in the league next year or in 2 years. Is Utah the main obstacle? Is Washington the main obstacle? Oregon under Dan Lanning? How would you process those kinds of tension points?
It's funny. Maybe it's a cop-out, but I would argue Stanford is the main obstacle. I think that retaining players has been an issue for the last few years. And again, it has been everywhere. This is the culture we live in. Guys get their degrees and they want to go play somewhere else, and that's fine. And you don't begrudge them. But the problem with Stanford is you can't replace those guys. You can't pluck a transfer from the portal. So you got more going out just by definition than you're going to have going in. So it becomes critical. You look at the pieces on Stanford's roster right now, especially on the offensive side of the ball, but some key defensive players too. There is some really high-level talent. And if you can keep 80% of those guys in the fold, say for 2023, obviously Tanner McKee being the first, that completely revamps the outlook, because by that point, you've got a really good recruiting class who will be sophomores, and they'll start to develop and they'll start to actually help you out X's and O's wise. And we'll see if they can back it up with another good class this year. So I think for me, the Stanford needs to figure out its game plan in terms of how or if it is going to compete in this era of NIL and this era of the transfer portal, because I think we're at an inflection point and we're getting there a lot quicker than maybe we thought even a year ago in terms of sort of the university philosophy on all of that, right? This isn't a school where, you've got all the billion-dollar tech companies in the world in your backyard, but right now there's no mechanism for those tech companies to say, hey, we'll give you $500,000 if you come play for Stanford, right? That's not happening in our place. So how do you keep up with the Joneses in that front? We'll find out. So for me, that is the most important factor in the next few years. As far as the opponents and whatnot, I think your Utah assessment is right on. Obviously, if Kyle retires, who knows, right? He's got to be the most, if not the most underrated coach in America for the last 15 years, certainly in the conversation. So you figure probably Utah takes a hit if and when that happens. But this is the one contra, the contra argument, I guess, would be, you hate to have a weak Pac-12 for all the reasons we've talked about, but if you're a team who's in the bottom half and trying to get into the top half and get well in a hurry, a lot easier to do it in a weak Pac-12 than it is in a really strong Pac-12, right? I think right now the door is open, right? We all expect that USC is going to be great again. We don't know if it's going to happen eventually or a year or two. We don't know how long that's going to take. So the window is there for somebody or somebodies over the next couple of years to be that second team, if you will, or even that first team. And, it's just a question of who can take advantage.
Scott Reese, Stanford play-by-play. Scott, we so much appreciate you stopping by, laying down the knowledge for us, and getting us caught up on Stanford football.
Anytime, guys. It was fun.
Thank you.